Welcome to the AdTechGod Pod, your window into the world of advertising technology and the people behind it. I'm your host, AdTechGod. Welcome, AdTech enthusiasts, to another episode of the AdTechGod Pod. I'm your host, AdTechGod. For the new listeners joining us today, this podcast focuses on the people behind the technology, their journeys, their milestones, and their challenges. A fun and personal spin on an industry that can often be overwhelming and constantly changing. This podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and more. Today, we have a true legend with us on the podcast. I refer to him as the godfather of programmatic, and his impact on the industry is nothing short of legendary. His involvement with some of the most well-known names in the industry, beginning with Poindexter Systems, and our industry's darling, Mediamath. Joe's contribution to AdTech is unparalleled. Joe is currently general partner at Aperiam Ventures and an advisor and board member for industry-leading companies like FXM, Mint, and many more. Joe's influence continues to shape the AdTech landscape. On today's podcast, we will also chat a bit about Mediamath's recent acquisition by Infilion and what the future holds for Mediamath and AdTech as a whole. Please join me in welcoming Joe Zawadzki. Joe, welcome to the pod.
Thank you, AdTechGod. I'm delighted to be here. I may not try to say AdTechGod pod too often.
You know, I wasn't sure what I would call it, and I figured, why not? You know, this all started for fun.
I happen to love it.
It's been fun. The naming of the podcast itself, obviously, just wanted something a little bit funny. You know, this whole thing started off as really like, hey, let me venture out, do something a little bit different, something I'm not comfortable with. And it's really turned out to be successful, and I'm very happy with where it is. Joe, thank you again for being here. I appreciate your support, and I appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule.
What shall we talk about, ATG?
Well, let's start with the journey. On every podcast, I kind of go back to why or how you got into AdTech. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, how you got into AdTech from the very beginning?
25 years in, the journey could be long, so please feel free to nudge me forward. But like many, was a accidental marketer on a couple of fronts. Back in 1999, started that aforementioned Poindexter Systems with a robust background in the space through 2 years of real estate investment banking, but was a avid sort of early adopter, I suppose, of e-commerce back in those days when it was that in and of itself was quite novel. Decided with a lot of the businesses that were starting out in the West Coast that a New York-based, what really was a MarTech startup back then was the world was ready for one of those, and the business started in sort of the widgets to websites for websites space in terms of optimizing the shopping and merchandising experience for some, flagship brands ultimately, like the Amexes and the Deltas and, the like, but originally in the, affiliate, marketing space with a lot of the, then kind of newer retailers that were, didn't have a lot going on their site, and the goal was to kind of optimize the merchandising, the shopping experience, which, everybody had some perspective on because, we were all sort of consumers, in those days, and kind of realized that the delta between the promise of e-commerce and what the internet, could bring, and then the, actual reality, there was a, sort of a big delta. And so first business started there, realized that the clients were basically at the time saying, listen, you're doing a great job on our website, but want you to get people to my website. And if you thought my site navigation was a problem, you wouldn't believe what's going on in sort of my, my media off my site. And so I like to say, with the naivete and hubris of youth, decided to go figure out this advertising thing, based on what clients were asking for, and thus began a multi-decade journey in advertising.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredible when you look back at even just what you said, right? Like, how do we take our website from widgets to sites? Like, we're going way back to early internet, and then even just e-commerce itself, like looking at the sheer size of the e-commerce market today and the retail media networks today, like what a behemoth of an industry just on its own, excluding all other ad tech, looking at the e-commerce market itself is just enormous.
Yeah, and I think the cyclicality of the space, or the same themes end up needing to be sort of tackled and retackled as the market evolves here. And the fact that we're sort of back in a lot of ways to the convergence between advertising and commerce. It was sort of the motive force 20 plus years ago, and then really became quite siloed in the market, and they were viewed to two distinct budgets, two different parts of the funnel, different teams working on them, and back to where we are in 2023, everyone's sort of appreciating, we get it, those two things are parts of a whole, and that understanding the inputs around marketing and sort of connecting it to the commerce outcomes, terrestrial and e-commerce, both that is sort of the journey. And so people are now back to breaking down some of the reasonably artificial silos that were sort of developed, and obviously that's creating lots of opportunity. Retail media networks being sort of a good example, but also just a sort of discomfort of fragmentation and sort of reaggregation. I think is creating a whole other sort of set of challenges and opportunities for people. But maybe back to the top, perhaps sort of saw in the earliest of days that, again, this sort of difference between what people said they were doing or what they could do and what was actually happening. Realized now it's sort of one of the big kind of motive forces of like, why does this particular industry work this way? Why does it have this sort of idiosyncrasies? Why doesn't it work like the theory of the case? Tends to have been what sort of keeps the one foot sort of moving in front of the other. And really, I think to the what has the last 20 years sort of been all about, has largely been around, okay, people appreciate that the introduction of technology and data science, it dates me to say that, when I began, a lot of people actually created that distinction, that I went into marketing because I didn't like technology and I didn't like math. And then, here we are now. And again, it's amazing just so how prevalent and how needed those sort of skill sets are. And, once they get to be ubiquitous, you sort of ask yourself, what's the, sort of what are the next order problems? Now that in fact it is everywhere. And, I think you're starting to find, people starting to tackle the organizational, challenges of these silos, both inside their organizations. And then in terms of who they partner with, I think there's, a lot of appropriate work now, not just skirting around the edges of kind of properly measuring and attributing, marketing and advertising, but, doing it sort of properly in a way that could actually be used to move budgets, and, make consistent decisions across the C-suite. Just despite all the work, there's a lot more, work to do, but, because of the success of the space.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on a lot. I think when we talk about the clear distinction of budget allocation towards advertising, media, e-commerce, seeing how those, two, or even, I guess if you want to label it, three, have converged into one key output, the market has changed a lot. The rise of the RMNs has really driven a outcome-based marketing mentality from companies rather than, I guess, the ad tech strategy, which was, delivery. It's now become more of an outcome game. So measurement's super important there. And obviously, as the industry continues to change and the market continues to evolve, we start to see that outcome-based marketing directly tied to e-commerce just continues to grow. You also touched up a lot about kind of like this full circle of life. I've joked about it before. I think I have a Lion King meme out there somewhere, which, he's holding up, Simba, and it's the circle of life, the ad network world. And so I think it's interesting to see how over the last 20 years or so, how a lot of the same trends continue to come back and forth. And we evolve to satisfy our marketers and satisfy outcome-based marketing.
Yep. Yeah, there's paradox and things, but there's two things that came to mind with that. One is the arc of time bends toward justice. I think the marketing ultimately is around that closed loop, right? Is around connecting inputs to outcomes, and the ad network model is actually particularly good at doing it. And then there's the desire to sort of automate that and make it sort of enterprise and make it scalable and change the ownership of it. And whatnot. And that, again, sort of creates the infrastructure, the, technology need, and then, sufficient complexity, is created in different categories and different parts that need to come together. And, you sort of go back to the people that are able to build packaged solutions and manage that complexity, in pursuit of like a bigger idea or kind of the order of magnitude, scale or, set of innovations. Requires people to kind of get their hands dirty and sort of do it again. And then, once it's clear how it gets done and that the recipe is possible, then again, people are like, okay, I want to do that myself. I want to, have that in software. I want to have that in technology. And I think ultimately you have these like commented on yesterday, like there's a 7-year macro cycle, a 3-year micro cycle. Evolution is sort of what propels the industry forward. But it does give you a lot of opportunity to kind of look back and be like, oh yeah, that, that thing that, we all collectively did in 2014 or in, 2007, great idea, the market wasn't quite mature enough. But if we sort of dusted that thing off and brought it back, could be the perfect solution to the sort of problem at hand.
I feel that way all the time. I feel that I hear solutions. I feel like I'm like deja vu. Last time it didn't work, but we didn't have the right technology or the right capabilities. And maybe this time around it's going to work because the market is ready. Joe, I wanted to ask you, like you've done so much, you've accomplished so much, obviously in your lifetime and in your career. And you've gone through, your early journey with being an investment banker, which I didn't even know that, by the way. I know you do that now, but didn't know that that's how you initially got into it. What are some of the major, I guess, highlights of your career? I know Mediamath obviously is like a household name in the industry, but what are some major highlights and milestones that you'd like to share with everyone today throughout the last, 20 years?
Here we go.
We're getting into it.
We're getting into it. Look, I that idea of having helped sort of advance, how an industry functions and, turn concepts that were not just novel, but in some cases sort of deeply resisted. I've told this story before, but it really is seared pretty indelibly in my mind. But I remember one early meeting with Walker Jacobs, then at Turner. And, the conversation was around, hey, would love the ability to, score media impressions based on their, predicted value to an advertiser. And we think it's crazy that, we've got to buy this, bushel of impressions and kind of hope there's enough of grains in there to, to warrant the purchase. And wouldn't it be better if we could just score these impressions and take a look at them and decide which ones are the most valuable and pay more for those and just not buy the other ones? And, now super obvious stuff and sort of the backbone for, really all of addressable across all formats. But, at the time it was like, what are you talking about? You're going to, cherry pick my audiences. You're going to strip mine my inventory. This makes no sense at all. Please leave. In Walker's case, actually, the technical implementation at the time, made him right. There's like such breakage in sort of how to do this, buy side decisioning prior to the, the creation of, DSPs and SSPs and real time bidding and everything else, that the cost was actually higher than the, the value, at least from the publisher's perspective. The fact that, again, it's sort of, not just ubiquitous, but we're on sort of, second and third and fourth order regulation, sort of market restructuring around the way the industry has to work, in a more sort of designed way as opposed to the organically build one, the desire for standards and all the rest of it. You take some pride in that. Absolutely, in being able to look and say,
what was created was really what the backbone of our industry is today, right? I mean, when we look at where we are now, everything is a result of it. Everything is a result of the way the inventory was valued, scored, and acquired. It really has become a foundation for us. And to think that 20 years ago, this was almost like a totally new concept that people may have looked at and said, this is may not work. And you look now and how many companies are actually built upon that idea or that concept is incredible.
Yeah, and I think, I take as much pride, I suppose, in the highlights in the how to get there, right? In that, it requires a bunch of different people in a bunch of different organizations that often come in with whether it's incentives or whether it's worldviews or whether it's sort of expectations about how their particular company works. That requires like change management, and it requires, not just inside of one organization, but to get, a whole bunch of companies from, brands and agencies to AdTech to, media owners and, everybody to sort of work together toward a shared goal without being able to get necessarily everybody in a room together and say, okay, like we all work for the same firm. Let's go do X. That's hard enough in and of itself. But to get, constellations of businesses whose, day jobs often have to change in order to do it, you have to go out there and you've got to find people that are, willing to be, not just entrepreneurs, but I have a lot of passion for the intrapreneur, the people that are inside of large organizations that, ultimately have to ask their peers to change. And that's sometimes a lot harder even because there's, antibodies against it. And to be able to kind of find this community in the early days and stay close to the people and bring new people into it, and ultimately sort of create this almost a sort of the change in a profession, and all of us kind of working together towards those ends. And both the people that have been here for a long time, but also the fact that there's like so many new and amazing people that have come into this industry is it's just extraordinarily gratifying. And that's part of one of the reasons I like about the Aperiam venture job to some extent is you're often just meeting with young entrepreneurs that are in exactly the same place that, we were 20 years ago, where you're looking at how a particular system works and questioning, why it works that way. And what they're questioning is not, the way media planning has been, done in the, traditional, linear world for 50 years, but they're looking at the stuff that we built and saying, well, why that seems weird. Had a meeting today with a company that's basically just rebuilding the ad stack in the Web3 version. And it's like, well, why are we centralizing all of this stuff? Doesn't that, create too many hops, too many middlemen, too much, opportunity for opacity? What if we just built the distributed, blockchain enabled, Web3 ad stack? And it's like, yep, it's about time. It's about time for somebody to look at it and say, we think the whole thing should be gutted and rebuilt. And that's fun. If you can sort of creatively destruct a lot of the stuff that you've been working on and in for a long time, I just find that just constantly sort of refreshing.
I mean, there is a lot of fun in trying to dissect something and improve it. I think creating something from scratch is obviously a challenge on its own, but really taking a look at something that's become a standard and then suggesting changes or improvements has got to be super challenging, because the entire industry now operates in one particular way. To kind of question that logic and that system and that process to try to improve it has got to be super satisfying and gratifying when you look at the outcome and the result of actually having that implemented across an industry. So, I mean, that's pretty amazing. And Joe, let me tell you, I mean, if there is a time for change and if there is a time to improve, it's really now. I feel that you may agree, you may not agree, but we have been operating in a structure and in a way that has not evolved that much in the last 10 years. And now as streaming and connected TV continues to evolve, as like I said, retail media networks continue to grow, as fast channels continue to expand, like we're seeing an entire industry turned upside down to a, I guess, mentality and a process that we're not necessarily used to. And so seeing the innovation and the startups that I've spoken to or even interacted with just through social media channels is actually a lot of fun. Like seeing where they're at as a 4-man, 5-man crew, trying to build out something incredible is really fun to watch. And this rise of entrepreneurship in the space that is not built on the standard structure and processes and tech that we have is pretty cool to see.
No, I'm definitely preach here, ATG. I think that's right. And I think two things that I find the most interesting about this is, one, sometimes just things have to get bad enough before people are willing to do the hard work. And there's a lot in today's world that you've already touched on, right? So kind of last miling into sight, sound, and motion, sort of, CTV at scale, at least in the US, and handful of other markets. It's not quite as globally distributed as I think we think sometimes. between streaming and sort of now truly omni-channel, if you sort of thought of it that way. And then, the fragmentation around sort of retail media, it was starting to feel concentrated in a not necessarily productive way, right? People were just, relying on the big easy button in the same way that they did on linear TV for, too long, started to rely on the big easy button of sort of simply Google and Facebook, at least in the, your first $100 million of ad spend. And then, the retail media opportunity sort of opened people's eyes to be like, oh boy, there's, a whole bunch of other platforms out there that are, have emerged that if you could be there first, if you could have, better connection would create some, wonderful opportunity. But boy, did it make the problem worse, of again, sort of fragmentation and sort of non-standard interactions with all of those partners. And when that happens, and then it happens at the same time that you have, some of the regulatory demands on a global basis, and sort of, finally, kind of leading with the consumer and sort of embracing, doing it in sort of the right way. If you were to shine a light on all of the, decisions and the data around, programmatic and addressable, would you be proud of it? Or, kind of at the point where it's, necessary. But when the problem gets bad enough, then people kind of return to first principles. It's like, all right, this is not I'm not putting a coat of paint on this house. This is a gut reno. And I'm going to redesign this thing, and I'm going to finally put the kitchen where I wanted it. And I'm finally going to build the patio in the back and all the rest. And that gives people a lot of license. And it does lead to startups, building new things and coming up with new solutions. But it's almost like headier to think about like the big marketing organizations and the amount of like willingness that they have to disrupt and do things. Right. The sort of P&Gs of the world, they're looking at it and saying, all right, let's start with us and kind of build our supply chain from the first party to the, end publisher, as opposed to filtering through the massive media and sort of trying to find their signal out of it. It just kind of gives people license to be, bigger and bolder. And my last little rant on this one, but people who, know me for more than a few years, I've been sort of the Mary Meeker of measurement, in the sense of like, this is the year of attribution. This is finally the year that people are going to kind of do it right. And they're going to like use their, measurement and their attribution platform to actually steer their business, and, use it as a way to get everybody to agree on, if we do this, then that will happen. And we all agree that we should do that. And that's been elusive in marketing as people sort of argued about what channel will have the most impact. Do we, think about, sort of incrementality? Are we, looking at last click? Like if you erase all of that and you're basically like, all right, let us get really high quality, measured signal and then use that to inform our model. It got bad enough in the old version, especially with the, maybe truly final, cookies, to require people to kind of go back to first principles and be like, all right, what are we marketing in the first place? What do we know? What systems do we have to, build or integrate with in order to be highly confident in our decisions? How do we, break down those silos? If we finally get there in like 2024 and 2025, after, 20 years of talking about it, even if it's because we've been drag kicking and screaming to have to do it, that'll be a monument.
Yeah, I think so too. I think, I don't think you realize this, Joe, but you provide so much insight with so little words. I mean, measurement attribution is really the core. And I've mentioned this before on one of the prior podcasts. Like in the end, like we are servicing the marketer. And when we lose sight of servicing the marketer, we lose sight of our vision and our core. In the end, we want brands to increase spend because they're seeing the outcomes that they want. And as we move more towards a cleaner supply path, as we move more towards providing outcome-based marketing solutions, really the MarTech, AdTech space starts to merge. And we're starting to see that clear divide get a little foggy. And we're seeing them join together to drive the outcomes that marketers and brands truly want. Okay, so I'm glad that we agree on everything, Joe. I feel like we usually do.
I've never heard anyone call me efficient with my words, so I disagree with you there. But other than that, we are fully aligned.
You're pretty efficient. You know what I've noticed is that you have a lot of context in what you say, but I think recording a podcast is so different because I'm it's not that I don't normally pay attention, but I pay attention much more because I'm writing notes. And in a normal conversation, I wouldn't be writing notes, Joe. I would just be chatting. So that's been amazing. As you take a look at industry people, what do you feel is going to be the biggest advice you can give to someone that's entering AdTech?
This is a tough one, actually. Maybe it speaks a little bit to where I think we all need some collective help, and I'm not sure this has been, solved yet properly at scale, but it's kind of hard to get up to speed still. Like I still have a number of conversations with folks that are looking to enter, and it's like, well, where do I start? And, obviously ATG and Marketecture pods, obviously, Ad Exchanger and, Digiday reads, but it's like hard to, I think, get a sense of the, gestalt of the space still. Have been sort of pretty intentional over the career of trying to make what, can be a complicated and, jargon filled and, sort of shifting, set of capabilities and players and brands and whatnot comprehensible to people in a shorter amount of time. But it is still hard. I would, love if there were sort of unbiased, try to do some of this with the IAB. The MET program was probably, most successful in a lot of ways, the kind of a real rotational through at least, a single company, but where people actually did all of the jobs and at least had sort of sympathy, in terms of like what needed to happen from a, client and operational and a technology and a data science perspective to then be able to come out with, enough of a 360 view to be choiceful about, where they wanted to go next, either inside of, the company or outside and, doing a lot of outplacement into, other firms now that people had sort of this journey person's experience in sort of doing it. But there is a throttle there in terms of like, how do you make it seem, attractive and get people up to speed, honestly. And that's a little bit where some of the danger of, one company, providing that training is that you kind of want the higher order perspective. And I would love to see sort of a Lumascape rotational, right? You explicitly take people from, advertiser to agency to, platform to publisher. And you almost force that rotational, over, a year. I don't think you could do it in 3 or 6 months. But I think the understanding of how a bill becomes a law, how the supply chain works, your point about, hey, advertiser ultimately, and not necessarily, true on the ground, but certainly as you move up the organization, they're trying to drive sales, right? And they're, trying to move the needle on the business. And they may be talking about top line revenue or market share today, and might be talking about, branded direct response tomorrow, and maybe talking about, efficiency and profitability and cash flow later. But like the marketing is in service to that. And if you started there and remembered that would be good. And then if you could jump to the other side, like, hey, what are media owners like? What do they care about? And, how do they think about their relationship with their consumer? And how do they think about the ad load? And how do they think about adding a new partner that might be not bringing sort of incremental demand, but it's, pretty easy to test and pilot? How do we feel about that? Right. If you gave people that sort of empathy and sympathy by, kind of moving around the org and doing it efficiently, there could be a lot of power there.
Well, it's funny you say that, Joe. Wasn't going to mention it on today's podcast at all. That is something that I'm working on. It is having the conversation. Yeah, it is something that I am working on. It is a combination of really bringing people together to discuss their challenges, their future, and how they can work together more closely. This is not just focused on the supply side, demand side, or buy and sell side, but it goes beyond that. It is at the conceptual phase now. I think with you saying all this, it's something I'm going to move forward with. Just hearing you say that would be so valuable, I feel that it's something that I should definitely accelerate and hopefully get something out by the time I release this podcast in a few weeks. But yeah, I agree with you. AdTechGod.com has a bunch of courses and classes you can take. It's all available through third parties like, wonderful companies like Magnite, IAB, U of Digital. They're all listed there, maybe 15 or 20 of them that have courses for the basics. But to move beyond the basics, it's either work experience or it's mentorship, meaning somebody puts you under their wing. Companies like Oh Hello are doing this, but really it needs to be more of an industry-wide initiative, and that is something that I'm trying to kickstart. It's really difficult. It requires a bunch of time, but I stay up late and I wake up early, so the day's really 22 hours in my life.
It's almost cliche, but I'll have to say, well, thank God.
Yeah, right. It's amazing. Joe, and then everybody listening, which I'm sure want to know, we are very familiar with Infilion. We are very familiar with Mediamath. And we know that your involvement throughout the past few months has really driven this strategy forward for what's being done. As we kind of wrap up the podcast in the next, 7-8 minutes, what can you tell us about the future of Mediamath, Infilion, and of course, the future of AdTech, what you're seeing?
Look, I'm very excited that Mediamath has found a new home. Maybe unlike you, I knew parts of Infilion prior, that sort of Truex and, Gimbal and otherwise, but I've got my own sort of, crash course about, really the kind of breadth of some of the other assets, there, and have been working to say, okay, like where does the platform go? But, how do you remix kind of modern media platform where you had ironically, the license and luxury is to have it zero-based, given the circumstances. And it's interesting. I mean, I think ultimately, Rob and Laurel and team, we are ultimately the ones that are sort of on the hook here for delivering. But the team at sort of Aperiam and the aforementioned sort of Project Phoenix folks have a particular point of view about where the industry should go, and where we think there's a super strong opportunity for Mediamath and everything else that certainly Infilion has sort of assembled, largely through M&A over the years. And mentioned this before, but I think the verticalization of media is kind of just obvious, right? And I think people finally have seen it in the in the form of retail media, but every other vertical is going to have their own instance of a set of people that kind of understand each other's KPIs. That you're in a B2B, or you're in pharma, you're in gaming entertainment, you're in politics, right? Each of those verticals has its own idiosyncratic requirements, and some companies are horizontals, right? That are capabilities that span all verticals, span all media. And I think a lot about what are the capabilities that stretch across. And you think about, creative's an obvious capability that needs to stretch across all media activation platforms, whether it's a walled garden or open web or other things like measurement attribution. Don't make any sense unless they span across touch points, right? It's hard to, understanding how to make allocations across channels, requires you to have a perspective across channels. And then you have these, vertical crosscuts that I believe strongly people will start to increasingly build. Mediamath platform in a lot of ways was, perfectly suited to that for some sort of fundamental reasons, right? The sort of the early commitment to transparency, for example, in source, and being willing to be ruthless around the sharing of data and make it easy. I think harder for people to kind of build their business off of a foundation that they don't trust, and transparency is at least a stepping stone to trust. Going to show you what's going on there. So I think that's sort of a platform capability that was ahead of its time in a lot of ways, but now sort of perfectly suited to kind of build something durable on top of. I think the enterprise controls that, Mediamath had built, quite valuable in that, where sort of power users can, configure a supply chain, integrate different partners, sort of exposing the algorithm, to third parties to be able to move from sort of one size fits all, largely B2C oriented and, cross vertical, or not vertical specific, perhaps, into one that's sort of customized for the particular needs of a vertical. That a long passion for B2B. You just think about the B2B marketing problem relative to the B2C marketing problem, and B2B marketers are out there trying to reach constellations of potential buyers and influencers over a long period of time in order to purchase a $250,000 annual price point product. And the way you communicate with those people in an organization just looks different than, trying to get somebody to, buy a one and done product on an Instagram ad. And plus, the direct curation to the types of publishers that might have, not been, sort of appreciated in kind of a one size fits all kind of generic platform. You get special attention when you realize, you're trying to connect to Ziff Davis, in order to reach a, sophisticated CTO buyer on some of their properties, and they kind of need, sort of different care and feeding. There's data partners like the Bomboras and the IDGs and the D&Bs that, you'd need in B2B that, again, if you were just kind of sorting through the unfiltered list of data providers in a, sort of the average platform, they'd fall near the bottom. But for B2B applications, need to bubble up and rise to the top. So, again, I think, the media platforms are long designed with some of those like enterprise needs in mind. And then the fact that, sort of Infilion's like, great, we, we'll have the resources to put behind this. And then, to the extent that the market agrees and those opportunities, in fact, unfold, then I think, we're going to see lots of, investment, behind that. So,
I mean, you touch up on like really three major points, right? I think transparency was one of them. So I think that continues to be a trend and a requirement for the market in terms of the inventory, the buying transaction data. You talk about measurement, also key point for the industry, trying to drive the outcome-based marketing, cross-channel or omni-channel. And you talk about controls and those controls with increased regulation, with whether B2B or B2C, controls are really important, and being able to provide those controls to buyers is also key. And I think just those three, I mean, shoot, if you just had two of them, it's pretty incredible. Having all three really does provide a unique position in market that many are trying to achieve, and really is just the trend and the direction the industry is going in. So those three alone are incredible.
It's funny. I think if there are any former mathletes listening, they will either get a chuckle or a sigh at the this sort of outcomes transparency control mantra has, we've been sort of talking about for sort of 15 years. In a lot of ways, it's it just keep plugging away and sort of advancing it until those sort of pillars or that tripod becomes obvious. But that's kind of what it is, right? You need to be able to connect this, sea of complexity and tie it to outcomes. And those are, particular business outcomes. And that makes a lot of sense. And, the only way you can do that is, build on this transparency and then, deliver the tech sort of technologies that give people the ability to control that and to kind of shape it into what they need. And, timing pressure makes diamonds. I think we're at that point now.
This has been an honor to have you on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited to see the new Mediamath, Project Phoenix, and of course Infilion, and to see their success in 2024 and beyond. That's the end of our podcast. Thank you again for being here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you soon.
It welcomes your blessing. Thank you, ATG.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the AdTechGod Pod, a podcast for the people, about the people that make AdTech great. Stay connected with me for more insights, trends, and interviews in the realm of AdTech. Don't miss out on our latest updates, so follow me on X, Instagram, and connect with me on LinkedIn. Don't forget, ATG Slack community has insights, networking opportunities, and jobs. Keep the conversation going and stay at the forefront of AdTech innovation.